Good morning, everyone. My name's Roy Green from the University of Technology, Sydney, and I'd like to welcome you all today to this special Committee for Sydney Global webinar. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, wherever you're currently joining us from. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of knowledge on this land and their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we're very delighted this morning, and for Willy, it's evening, of course, yesterday, to have Professor Willy Shih, the Robert and Jane Chiswick Professor of Management Practice in Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Willy is not only a highly regarded academic, he spent 28 years in industry, and indeed, I was reminded of the fact in talking to him previously that his Dean, Srikant Datta, has visited here many times in his earlier role as Professor of Accounting, and he was very helpful to us when I was Dean of the UTS Business School. Many members will be aware of Willy's very perceptive analysis of the complex interdependencies of global supply chains in a number of publications, including the Harvard Business Review, the Sloan Management Review, and Forbes. He's also a leading authority on manufacturing and how COVID-19 has exposed serious vulnerabilities and risks in the global connectivity we have all taken for granted. He's been paying particularly close attention recently to the global semiconductor shortages and what that can tell us about future trends. So this is a very timely and important conversation, and we're really delighted Willy could join us. Willy, by the way, will take questions after his formal remarks for 35 or 40 minutes. So please share your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavour to get us to as many of those as we can. So, Willy, good evening to you and welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Roy, and it's my pleasure to join all of you this morning. So I'm going to talk about supply chains kind of in this pandemic world and maybe in the post-pandemic world, what I think some of the changes might look like. Okay, so from an agenda standpoint, I'm going to first lead off with kind of supply chain complexity and interdependency, and how, maybe a lot of people made some rather brittle assumptions around that, and this mostly around lean and just in time and so on. And then I'm going to talk about really what has happened during the pandemic, where we had first a supply shock followed by a demand shock. Oh, by the way, with a backdrop, as you know very well in Australia, of increasing trade friction as well. Okay, and then today, what I see is us paying the price for this kind of concentrated risk and where I see things moving forward. Now, the interesting thing about supply chains, okay, is like, I used to ask students who coming into the school, is like, hey, where did that product come from? It's like, oh, I bought it at Amazon. It's like, no, how did it get to Amazon, right? It's like, but thanks to this pandemic, right, I would argue it's kind of like when the tide went out, it exposed a lot of the rocks underneath the supply chain, right? So now everybody's talking about supply chain because all of a sudden we see all the problems worldwide, so that's what I'm going to start with. Now, the background in this really is over particularly the last 20 years, okay, we've evolved to a system of a global production system, okay, and there are a couple of bases for this, okay, and I'm going to talk about those in succession. One is expansion of the tradable sector, okay, then specialization and fragmentation of supply chains, and then lean manufacturing applied to global supply chains. Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by the tradable sector? Well, goods are tradable to the extent that they can be manufactured somewhere other than where they're consumed. Okay, most manufactured goods, computers, phones, clothing, most of those products, if you can ship them by ocean or ship them by air, they are tradable. A lot of services are not tradable, things like haircuts, okay, or restaurant meals, although we have a lot of delivery services who are trying to expand the tradability of those things. Historically, improvements in communications and transport technology have always grown the tradable sector. Now, what we've seen in the last 25, 30 years in particular is, much more focus on this labor arbitrage. How do I move the manufacture of products to low-cost regions, take advantage of other factor costs? Maybe, I could use less capital if I use more labor, right? So we've seen this dramatic expansion of the tradable sector. Now, the other thing that's happened, which is kind of interesting, okay, is products used to be much more manufactured by companies in a very vertically integrated fashion. I'm going to do everything myself, okay? But what's happened is because of increasing complexity in technology and products, what we have is increased vertical disintegration or disaggregation, right? And a lot of this comes about because there are a lot of benefits from specialization, okay, where I'm going to work on one part, somebody else will work on another part, somebody else will work on another part, then I'm going to assemble all together. First of all, I get a division of labor, right? So, it's more than just one pair of hands or, one company can do. It allows me to manage complexity a little better because I can decouple these pieces, right? And that means I can also decouple the development schedule. Okay, so especially starting, if you look at computers, like in the early 1990s, for example, they were by and large made in one factory, okay? Although disk drives and things like that were made elsewhere, but you started to see much, much more specialization, okay? And then we see this offshoring of some of the pieces, more and more pieces over time. Meanwhile, you see more and more kind of this fragmentation, both onshore as well as offshore, right? So that specialization, like I said, had many benefits, especially with complex technology. I'm better able to put it in the hands of specialists who can get scale benefits and stuff like that, right? So if you look at, let's take an example, right? In Zoom land, everybody has a notebook computer nowadays. So if you look at a notebook computer, by and large, the main board one company is going to make, the microprocessor somebody else is going to make, the keyboard somebody else will make, the hard drive or the batteries, or this LCD screen. The LCD screen comes from a specialist, and all of these technologies are so complex, you really need specialists. Okay, so for example, you'll have one company making the chips, you'll have another company making the disk drives, right? Over here in the corner, we have somebody else making keyboards. Here we have the flat panel display screen. This is the factory I visited in Beijing, actually. Here I'm taking sheets of glass that are the size of the, a parking space for a small car. They're 0.5 millimeter thick. I'm going to make a sandwich. So what you see is a lot of specialization. People who do this, they don't know how to do any of the other things, right? So if you're a computer assembler, then you can take all the pieces and put them all together, right? So that's the driver of a lot of the specialization. Okay, now meanwhile, China, which started out just importing a lot of components, they've evolved from just doing assembly, right? It used to be, I'm going to source all the parts from all over the world and assemble in China because it's cheap. Increasingly now, the issue is increasingly I'm going to source components from China because that's where they're made, okay? And that's really the only place I can make it, right? So, our traditional view of Chinese manufacturing is something like this, manual assembly parts, here, your job is to put these 4 screws in 2,400 times a day, okay? Or traditional garment manufacture, right? I mean, this is what we always think of in terms of low-cost countries. But let me show you what China is increasingly looking like today. This is computer-driven bespoke men's suits, right, where everything is done computer-driven, or this is computer-driven furniture manufacturer, okay, or increasingly, this is the factory I brought students to visit last year. Makes 45% of all the microwave ovens in the world. One factory. Now it's a very big factory, okay, but things like that. So increasingly, China becomes a source for many of these things. Now, meanwhile, if you think about it, we have these global production systems. I always make the joke about Intel makes their Xeon processors for data centers. They make them in Hillsboro, Oregon, among other places, but that's the main factory. Then they should send the chips all the way over to either Chengdu, China, or a new factory in Vietnam or Malaysia, where they test the chips and they package them. Then they send them up to China, or now some they're moving back to Taiwan, but mostly they go to China, and they put them in the server board manufacturer. Then they send them back over to a Microsoft data center on the Columbia River Valley, maybe 20 miles from where the chips were made. Okay, but you have this global production system where things are very sequential, and they depend on this kind of reliable and predictable logistics. Okay, so now coming with that is you get a very deep tiering. Okay, where I'll have a manufacturer who will rely on a set of suppliers who may, each one of those suppliers may rely on more suppliers and may rely on more suppliers as well. So what you have is you have this tiered network of suppliers: first tier, second tier, third tier. The dirty little secret is that most manufacturers don't know who their third tier manufacturers are. You know, they'll know their first tier. They'll know, some of them will know their second tier. I was talking to a pharma manufacturer who said, frankly, they don't know anybody beyond the first tier. A lot of the first tier suppliers don't want you to know who's, you know, in the second or third tier, because they're afraid you might disintermediate them and go around them. Okay, so, but to actually figure out all the people in your supply chain is a very time-consuming and very expensive task. So a lot of people don't do it. Right. So we have these complex interdependencies. I wrote a case. This is a funny company. They're a scientific hair care company, okay, in Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm looking at the side of the bottle. It's like, where does this stuff come from? Oh, we make it in New Jersey. Yeah, but where do the ingredients get to New Jersey? Well, some were made in the US, some came from Germany, some came from India, some came from China via India, some came from Germany via China. Okay, some came, so it's very, very complex. Or, you know, the great example is fish caught in Alaskan waters and they're sent to China to be filleted because it's cheaper, and then you freeze them and send them back to the US. Or I was talking to during the pandemic, we had this shortage of generic pharmaceuticals, antibiotics and things like that, right? You know, I was talking to a South African company who was a major supplier. It's like, well, we get some of our ingredients from China, we get some from India, some from the EU. Some of the ones from India come via, well, actually, some of the ones from the EU go to China, then they go to India, and then they come to South Africa, right? So very, very complex interdependencies, many of which people don't necessarily understand. This is an example of, it's a shoe made by VF Corp. Sorry about the focus there. Okay, the shoes are actually assembled in the northern part of Vietnam with materials that come from all over the region. A lot of them come from China. There's this interesting supplier in Taiwan who owns the factory in Vietnam, who procures a lot of material from Singapore, which then go up to China for processing, or maybe go to Taiwan for processing. It's a mess. It's very complicated. To draw a map like this it takes a lot of effort. Okay, now we're all talking about vaccines these days. The Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine, this was reported in the Economist. They have 280 suppliers in 19 countries. Right, so you get a sense for the complexity associated with this. Now, a lot of people, a lot of manufacturers have surprisingly complicated supply chains. Automakers, for example, it turns out for a typical automaker, you'd like to run it, the kind of efficient scale is 250,000 vehicles per year out of one factory, right? So what you'd like to do is run one model or closely related models in one factory, okay? So what they do, for example, in the case of BMW, they have the largest BMW factory in the world is actually in South Carolina in the US. Okay, they'll make X3, X4, X5s for the whole world, okay? And then this was a BMW factory in South Africa that makes 3 Series for Europe. 3 Series sedans for Europe. So what they'll do is they'll organize a network of factories and they'll make particular models of particular ones, and then they'll transship them around, hoping to avoid an empty backhaul with these ships that move the vehicles around. Right. So it's nice when it works, right? But it's a complicated network, and so that's what we have. Okay, so now let's go back to February 2020, right? When all of a sudden there was this supply shock. Okay, I only marked 2 suppliers. If you're putting together a car and you lose one supplier, you only need to be short a part and you can't make that car anymore. But so many parts come from China. February 2020, first we had the supply shock. Okay, because China basically shut down on January 20th. I was in China on January 12th, and I came back and I remember telling the editor of the Harvard Gazette, I said, "This is going to be bad." He said, "Really?" In the U.S., the stock market was hitting a new high, and I said, I can't understand, right? It's like this COVID thing is going to hit us because all these suppliers were shutting down for Chinese New Year as they were not opening for a while. Okay, now the reason most people didn't see it is because if I put my products on a container ship, it's not going to make it to Antwerp for 40 days. Okay, by the time I get it to the port and so on. So it's like it was very predictable. And hey guys, in 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, you're going to see this big problem. Okay, so now what we actually saw happen is first there was a supply shock. Okay, but then as the rest of the world shut down and everybody stopped buying things, all of a sudden, nobody had anywhere to ship anything. Nobody wanted to ship anything because nobody could receive anything, right? So then these were called blank sailings, where the container line said, blank sailing is a euphemism for, I'm going to cancel that ship because I don't have enough traffic. So then we saw all these blank sailings. So you saw that peak right around Chinese New Year, okay, but it continued pretty much into the summer because people were saying, well, demand hasn't picked up. So now what happened in the US in particular, then we had this demand surge, okay, and Europe has been a little more muted, but it's, the US really drove this. So then we had this huge demand surge where everybody's, we put all the stimulus money into everybody's pocket, so then we have this demand surge, right? So, if you look at historic US trade in goods with China, right? This was during the Trump administration, things were going down for a while, but then, things have been hitting records every month right now, right? In terms of the trade in goods. So then what happens is when you have this huge demand surge, look what happens to the container rates, okay? And so it used to be, this is China to Europe. So from a southern China port to Antwerp, Rotterdam, Felixstowe in the UK, Bremerhaven, usually Antwerp, Rotterdam, those are the main ports, okay? It used to cost just under 2,000 US to ship a 20-foot container, 1 TEU, and it has now reached $13,000 US, right, which is kind of dramatic. The trans-Pacific rates to the US are even more extreme. Now this is really interesting, right? It used to cost you about $1,800 to ship 1 TEU from southern China to Los Angeles and Long Beach, and the rate here is $13,000. Notice that spike recently, right? So that's kind of interesting. So this back and forth has caused, real dislocations in supply chain. In the US, our major port of entry for Asian imports is Los Angeles and Long Beach, okay? And we've seen the highest spot rates ever in the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index, okay? And, the surge of containers. Now, during the pandemic, what happened is a lot of distribution centers were closed. So a lot of merchandise piled up in containers, right? So then there are no empty containers to go back. And you have these ships coming in, with extra ships coming in to bring all these containers, and it overwhelmed the ports and infrastructure, right? So the American ports just haven't been able to handle it. But then what you have is this huge imbalance of where the containers are versus where they need to be. Now, there was another very funny thing that happened, okay? I happened to go visit this place on the border between Kazakhstan and Xinjiang. This is called Horgos. right? And the Chinese, and Russians and Kazakhs had, built this trans-Eurasian rail link to take container traffic from China to Europe. Okay, and so I visited there. Okay, and I have to tell you, it was kind of interesting. There was no traffic. They brought people in when I visited to move containers from one train to the other to make me think that they're busy. And I said, well, how much traffic you guys handle? Well, we handle 3 trains a day, 55 containers per train. It's like, that's not a whole lot, okay? And it turns out it's because it was so expensive. The Chinese government was subsidizing. All of a sudden now, because of all the container traffic, this thing is overwhelmed, right? They are running block trains, the traffic has gone up 10x. So like a whole bunch of dislocations and trade patterns. Let's talk about cross-sector impacts, okay? In particular, automotive, right, which is really interesting. Now, what we've heard a lot about is shortages among the automakers, right? This was a headline from the Wall Street Journal about Ford and other automakers cutting cutting production. Well, the problem is they didn't realize that, as an automaker, I'll source from a tier 1 supplier like Bosch or Continental or somebody like that. And, they may in turn source from another contract manufacturer who will buy chips from a fabless semiconductor company like NXP Semiconductor or Infineon or ST Micro or Texas Instruments. And then a lot of those fabless companies in turn source from companies like TSMC in Taiwan or Global Foundries in the US or Samsung and so on. Okay, and what they didn't realize was that they shared suppliers and shared some of that capacity. So let me give you a little more background, right? Because it's very informative what actually happened. We hear all about autos. Now, one of the things I always remind people, and the US people don't really think about this, the largest auto market in the world is China. Okay, and what you see is in 2017, they made about 24 million passenger vehicles, about 4 million commercial vehicles. In 2017, US made around 11.5 million and sold 17 million, right? So China, in terms of manufacturing, is more than twice as big as the US. Now, for various reasons, that was a peak, okay? And then auto sales in China were coming down, right? So going into 2020, the projection in January 2020, the projection was for a down year compared to 2019. Okay, now that was before the pandemic. Okay, then the pandemic hits. Okay, and let's look at what happens with the pandemic. Let's see, China vehicle sales in January down 20%. In February, ooh, this will take your breath away, down 82%. March down 46%. Okay, and then they started to recover in April. Meanwhile, with the normal, remember I told you about this time lag, Europe drops 46% in March, 80% in April, US drops 39% in March, 52% in April. Okay, that's like serious drop, right? So what happens, and everybody forgets this, right? April 2020 in the US, the automakers were all, and this is a chart from Boston Consulting Group from that time. The automakers were, how do I keep from going bankrupt again? It's like, how about if I cancel all my incoming orders? Nobody's buying cars, stop bleeding cash, right? So either they canceled orders or they didn't order the stuff that they need because they want lean production, right? So then of course, what's going to happen next? Well, all the notebook computer people, work from home, exercise equipment, home appliances, TV sets, all those guys start pulling on the same foundries and semiconductor manufacturing capacity down the road, right? By the time these guys figure out it's time to reorder, right? I'm going to show you, this is the Global Foundries fab in Malta, New York. They make Foundries makes a lot of automotive parts on older technology, right? This is your little $15 billion factory that makes 350,000 wafers of chips a year. It's relatively small. That's what you get for $15 billion. Okay. If you want to build another factory like this, it'll take you 2 years before you can get all the equipment. Okay. And then you have to get all the equipment certified and stuff like that. By the way, a lot of these tools, some of this equipment, like these machines here, those are what are called wafer tracks. They feed these lithography scanners. The lithography scanners are $100 million each. Actually, the newest ones are 150 million euros each, which is even more. Right. So it takes some time to build that capacity. Okay. And after you build the capacity, it might take you 60 days to get the chip made. Okay. And even longer to get it through the whole. So it'll take time to just build that up. Now, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, they came under a lot of pressure. The German government called them up. President Biden's people called them up. It's like, can you please make more microcontroller chips? Because you're shut down our auto industry, and that's a lot of jobs. Okay, now they just had their earnings call, and they said in the first half of 2021, they grew their microcontroller volume by 30%. Their forecast for the full year is they're going to make 60% more. Okay, now that's a lot, right? Because it's not like we wanted to make 60% more cars, right? So where are all those chips going? Okay. The other thing that's interesting about the chip shortage is what kinds of chips. It's very informative, right? Because a lot of the chips are older technology, right? They are things like these timer controller chips or display driver chips. Display driver chips are a big one, right? If you're using a flat panel display in the navigation system in your car, or the entertainment system in your car, or your TV set, or your notebook computer, those are all going to use some of these display driver chips. This is not, these are not exactly super profitable chips. They sell for like 40 to 60 cents. Okay. By the way, if you have limited foundry capacity and you have somebody who's willing to pay more, make these more expensive chips, what do you think is going to happen? Right. So, one of the big shortages has been on these power management chips. Okay. Very old, this is last of the big spenders, right? 10 cents to $1. Okay, and a lot of people use them. So, in your mobile phone, you have anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 parts, depending on the model. And there's probably a handful of these power management chips. Right? They don't cost a lot, but if you don't have them, you can't make a phone. A lot of the manufacturers talk about clear to build. I am clear to build when I have all of the parts I need to build a particular phone. So this has been the story of the computer industry, the chip industry, all the issues associated with that. Meanwhile, as I told you, one of the pictures I'm trying to paint is how everything is connected in this world today. Okay, so it's like, how can a surge in work from home and online shopping hurt U.S. agricultural exports? Right. Well, this is a crazy world. So what happened is, I told you, everybody is trying to ship all this product. Okay, so then there becomes an imbalance of containers, right? Because the trade balances are such that the U.S. imports much more than it exports to China. Same with the EU. The EU imports more than it exports. That's why, for example, the U.S., we export, our largest export is like, it used to be waste material, right? Recycled plastic or recycling, which China doesn't want anymore, but is the largest export now is waste paper, okay, or scrap metal, because it's like, I'm going to put it in the container and ship it back. Or a lot of grain exports go in containers now rather than break bulk, okay? But the container lines can make so much money. Just give me those empties. I'm going to bring them right back to China rather than ship it to the Midwest of the U.S. to fill them with grain and bring it back. So huge controversy right now. So, surge in home entertainment equipment makes it harder to export grain. Who would have thought, right? But everything is connected. Okay. And then on top of that, for the chip industry, we have a couple other things, right? We had this fire at this AKM semiconductor fab in Japan last October. We had another fire at the Renesas fab in March of this year, 10 years, actually, 10-year anniversary of their Tohoku, East Japan earthquake and tsunami, right? We have this deep freeze in Texas, which affect resin production for plastics, but it also shut down a number of big chip factories, which took them 2 months to get going again. And of course, then we have the Ever Given in Suez, which screws up every supply chain. Right? More recently, what we've had is we had like Yantian, which is the major port in Shenzhen, handles almost half of all the Europe-bound and North America-bound trade from the Pearl River Delta, had a COVID lockdown, right? So it took them out of service for 4 weeks. Everybody's still recovering from that. Actually, yesterday, Ningbo in China, which is second largest port, had a COVID shutdown, right? So we're not done with any of this by any means, okay? So what we see, the picture I'm painting is like kind of concentrated risk, okay, in trade lanes and ports, shipments and suppliers. What do we learn? Okay, people are starting to talk about, yeah, maybe I need to understand fragility, maybe I need to diversify my sourcing, reduce some of my exposure to risk and so on. But, I tell people, it's like, look, you have a lot of economic pressure. People don't want to pay more for products, and we're not going to repeal any economic laws. All these risks have sort of been unpriced in all our equation. And then, of course, you have all these political pressures, especially in the US, to increase domestic production, reduce sourcing from quote unquote risky regions. Okay. So, here you have this supply continuity problem, okay, which is I have this long supply chain. People have been thinking about just in time. They forgot that, when Toyota really invented just in time, all their suppliers were nearby. You go to Toyota City in Nagoya, Japan, everybody's an hour away or 15 minutes away, right? But what people said is like, I have reliable logistics, so why don't I can build these global supply chains that account on that. But that turned out to be a bad assumption. So now people are thinking in terms of how do we do supply chain mapping? Who's in my supply chain? As I mentioned before, it's very hard to do this, but I need to identify where those common sources are, categorize those suppliers. Are they low, medium, high risk, and so on? Okay, we're seeing more supply chain diversification, China +1 or maybe China +2. We're seeing a lot of growth in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam in particular, although I think Vietnam is going to fill up. People haven't really gotten to this issue yet, but Southeast Asia hasn't built the infrastructure the way China has built, right? So, they're not ready for this huge wave. Okay, we're going to see this sectoral variation. Some sectors like the IT sector, we already see the big IT makers, Quanta, Foxtron, Wistron, Pegatron. They're already building more in Taiwan, Southeast Asia, even in India, although some of them are struggling in India, but they're still dependent on components coming out of China. Here's a question for you. It's like, could we do a better job predicting demand? Okay, now, somebody who used to work for me who's down in Melbourne complained to me last February 2020 about how people were stockpiling toilet paper. I don't know. You guys had that problem. Well, we had that problem here, but I heard about it in Hong Kong, and I heard about it in Australia. I heard about it in Japan. People stockpiling toilet paper, right? By the way, see this yellow line there? That was spike in demand in toilet paper in the United States. I wrote this piece in Forbes about that, inspired by my former employee in Melbourne. And I said, you don't need to know anything about toilet paper to tell you what the supply chain looks like, all right? Because demand is flat. It's not like there's one season where we're going to use more toilet paper, okay? So the inevitable consequence of everybody stockpiling toilet paper is at some point, we're going to have it coming out of our ears and people are going to stop buying it. Now, in the US, what happened is the big toilet paper makers starting in May of this year started missing their earnings because they had too much toilet paper and they couldn't sell it. Right? Go figure, right? Completely predictable, all right? Now, the other thing that was predictable is this whole notion of maybe I should simplify how many SKUs I have. Okay, now, like I said, I wrote this article in Forbes. It's my most popular article ever. Everybody in the world thinks I'm the world's expert on toilet paper, which I'm not. Okay, but I had one grocery chain in the US call me up and it's like, we're having trouble keeping toilet paper in stock. Okay, and I asked them, how many different SKUs, how many different varieties do you have? Anybody want to take a guess? 60. Okay, now it's like, all right, I understand 1 roll pack, 2 roll pack, 4 roll, maybe 12 roll pack, single ply, double ply, you know, house brand, 2 name brands. How do you get 60 SKUs? If you get 60 SKUs, you're never going to be able to forecast all those right. You'll never hit it right. Okay, and we've seen this in a lot of consumer goods. I tell people, hey, we taught you this in supply chain classes, right? It's like, you know, if you can pull demand over fewer SKUs, you know, it'll be easier to forecast, but everybody wants shelf space. Okay. A lot of people rethinking distribution, right? New blended picking strategies, new distribution patterns, a lot more investments in automation. I'm going to skip over that. It used to be if you're building a warehouse, the reason I build a warehouse is I'm going to break down bulk. I'm going to send it to, I'm going to repackage, I'm going to send it to stores where consumers will come in and pick stuff. Okay. But things that are changing is now warehouses are saying, I want to, you know, all this omni-channel, I'm going to break down, I'm going to fulfill direct to the individual, direct to the consumer, right? So if you're building warehouses, all of a sudden everybody says, oh, I'll convert my warehouse for e-commerce. It's like, not so fast. You know, first of all, I need to put more height in there because I need more SKUs if I'm going to fulfill the consumers. Okay, more hand picking, more on-site labor. It used to be these warehouses would have truck docks on both sides, you know, and I cross dock and I move sort stuff and stuff like that. Now, if I'm going to have hundreds of workers in the warehouse, I have to give them restrooms, I have to give them a canteen, I have to have offices and stuff like that. So it's changing a lot of that distribution infrastructure as well as you're seeing much more automation. Now in China, you see crazy things like this, JD.com, they have their delivery robots because they have high urban density. And it's like, you know, I can just send these out and then people will come up, you know, they'll get a text on their cell phone and then people can come up, punch in the screen and get my package. Okay. Not that many places have that kind of urban density, but you know, through all of this, there have been a lot of opportunities that I would say have surfaced. Okay, the key thing is like supply chain has never been higher on the list of hot topics, right? So a lot more people interested in working on it. Okay, current logistics is a mess. A lot of infrastructure shortcomings and direct impacts on trade, right? So we see actually U.S. government is going to be pouring money. The most important thing is I think the crisis has kind of unfrozen a lot of people's thinking on these things, okay, and on established processes. And a lot of people are seizing on the opportunity to change the way they do things. Okay, so I know I went a little longer than I planned to, but let me stop there and open it up for questions. I don't know if anybody has questions.
Thank you so much, Willie. That's been really enlightening and informative. We always hear right now that globalization is dead, but what you've shown is that globalization is very complicated and it's certainly not dead, it's changing, and there's a lot of realignment going on. Perhaps I'll start the questions, and I would ask anyone who does have any questions to just use that Q&A function. Please feel free to do so. And I'll just start off by asking you, Willie, with all these changes and realignments in supply chains, we're seeing inflation spiking, especially in the US, and there's a lot of concern about that. Is that going to be structural? Is it simply cyclical? Will it provoke recession? Just looking at that sort of macro context, what would you see going on in terms of price hikes that are driven by these supply chain mismatches?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, now our leaders in Washington want to believe that this is temporal and that this too will pass. Okay, but I look at a couple of things. One is the logistics costs. Many times we are talking about, both air cargo and ocean cargo are up 4x, maybe even approaching 5x, and surcharges on top of that. Okay. The other thing is you look at raw material costs, iron ore, I was talking to Roy earlier about my visit to the Pilbara and, how much, iron ore is up a lot, but a lot of other commodities are up as well, right? So, will there be a correction at some point? I'm confident that there will be, right? Because what happens is when the prices are so high, it always brings on too much capacity. But in the meantime, the question is, how long will it take before we see that correction and prices go back down? In some things, it'll be relatively fast. I was on National Public Radio yesterday, or 2 days ago, and a student called in and he says, I have to buy a computer. I'm going to school this fall. And I said, well, if you can wait until there's surplus inventory, you'll get a good deal. Okay, but the problem is he couldn't wait, because he needed it for school. I have a hard time seeing how these costs don't get passed on, and it really contributes a lot to inflation. Okay, in the US, just this e-commerce boom has meant Amazon is now paying $15 to $20 an hour and giving out large signing bonuses to people, and it's making it very hard to recruit manufacturing talent in the US, right? Because they're paying more than a lot of manufacturers, right? So it's hard for me to see how we're not into kind of a extended cycle, right? Now, if we have a downturn, it'll clear out a lot of that. So.
So I've got a few questions here, and I might combine a couple of them. Question from Eamon Waterford, another from Nicholas Loader. They congratulate you, by the way, on an intensely interesting presentation. The question is, did COVID also impact on workforce planning, especially in those industries that cannot be undertaken by robotics? So that's part one, and part two of the question is, and you partly answered that already, when might we see a quote return to normal? But start with the workforce planning issue.
Yeah, so I think the most striking example of workforce planning is happening in the airline industry. Now, I realize Australia has a little different situation, but in the US, what happened is the government put out very large subsidies to domestic carriers to, it was a paycheck protection program to keep people on board, but then that ended, right? So, and a lot of these airlines were losing $30–40 million a day, right? Which is serious money. So then what they did is they had to lay off a lot of people. Okay, but now we've had this resurgence in travel and they're all shorthanded, right? And it's understandable why they did it. They didn't really have much choice, okay? But we're in the US anyways, we're seeing a lot of turmoil in terms of competition for labor, right? And it's pushing labor prices up very dramatically, right? $15 an hour, $15 an hour in manufacturing 2 years ago was a good wage. Now you need $25 an hour to try to attract people, right? So the whole workforce planning, it varies by sector, varies by industry, varies by company. Okay, some who were impacted more than others. It's very dynamic, changing every day. When will all of this be over? I think, for example, the auto industry, I think we're already starting to see some improvements. Most people say in terms of semiconductors, it'll be into 2022 before things kind of return to normal. Now, returning to normal, in my view, means there's going to be a lot of surpluses. Everybody denies it, but people are double ordering. Okay, they are ordering more than they need because they don't want to be caught short again, right? My prediction will be there will come a time in a year or two when the CFO says, how come we have so much cash tied up in inventory? Get rid of some of that stuff, right? And then we'll go back to where we were, right? So,
and back to just in time.
Yeah.
Question here from Joe Brooks, which brings it back to Australia, and also a question that you've written about as well, Willie, in relation to reshoring. Joe asks, are there any lessons or opportunities for Australia in particular, given our size, isolation, and a renewed push for sovereign capability and adding value to our exports?
You know, it's a tough problem. The U.S. has the problem as well. We don't talk about it as much. I remember talking to people at CSIRO, because I visited them in Canberra. And they were working on all these projects. It's like we export all these minerals to China, and then we buy it back in higher value added products. Can't we make the higher value added products in Australia, right? And it's like catching fish in Alaskan waters and sending them to China for processing and then buying them back, right? One of the really tricky issues is, why is China so much less expensive? There's a lot of subsidization going on, okay, which you have to kind of battle. So, for example, why is steel in China, 30-40% cheaper than in the US or Europe? And I'm not sure steel prices in Australia, right? I'm buying iron ore at world market prices. I'm buying coking coal at world market prices. I'm buying energy at world market prices. I'm buying the same steelmaking equipment from the same Japanese or German companies. Why should it be cheaper? Okay, well, it has to be subsidy or free land or free this or free that. Okay, but then you look at it and say, if steel is 30 or 40% cheaper, in China, what if I make construction equipment? What if I'm a Caterpillar or a Komatsu or somebody like that, where 50% of my product cost is medium carbon steel, right? Then it's like, then I have to make that product in China in order to be globally competitive, unless it costs too much to ship. So it's a very complex issue, okay? And it's hard to prove a lot of these things, okay? But it's, that flat panel display factory that I showed you, in the upper right corner, that was a $6.5 billion factory, okay? And they invited me to their dedication of this new $6.5 billion factory in Hefei, China. I asked them, why is this factory in Hefei? There's no reason for it to be in Hefei. Hefei is the capital of Anhui province, which is like, most people don't know where that is, right? I had never been there. So I take the train to Hefei. Why is this factory in Hefei? It's like, well, because the municipal government subsidized the factory. How much did they subsidize it? $6.5 billion US. How much was the subsidy? 85%. Okay, so if you're going to make a product like that, you stand no chance making it anywhere else. Okay. So it takes a very thoughtful strategy. I mean, I don't think it's without hope, but there's some in the US who say, hey, if China wants to subsidize it and we get to buy it at their expense, what's wrong with that? Right? Very complex issue. That would be another hour discussion.
Right. A couple more questions we might be able to fit in here. From Rachel Shepherd, we ran out of important things like masks, oxygen, and vaccines. Governments override agreements to serve their national needs. How do you see that affecting supply chains in future?
Well, it's a very bad problem. Okay, I wrote a piece in Harvard Business Review about this a couple of months ago, right? Because we had a local textile manufacturer, the governor of the state of Massachusetts, all these local officials came to them, begged them to make personal protective equipment, hospital gowns and N95 masks. He took over 10 million of his own money and set up a factory to make it, okay, and ramped it up pretty quickly. And then the government, the Defense Logistics Agency, then went and made this huge buy in China because they cost half as much. And the problem, I've talked to these pharmaceutical manufacturers. I talked to one guy who's trying to make pharmaceuticals in the US. He said, the whole distribution structure is like, I'm making this critical vaccine, right? Or I'm making this critical antibiotic. You know how much profit I make on that per dose? It was like less than a penny per dose. It's like, why should I do that, right? Mm-hmm. So these are complicated problems that people haven't gotten their head around, that you may have to pay more. Right now, that's the converse of what the benefit of globalization has been, which is we get a much wider selection of products at lower costs, okay? And the price of that is you don't have supply independence, right? Very complex issue.
Yeah, we might just have time for one more, and I might just sort of aggregate a few questions here. There's a lot of interest in what governments can do, especially to promote localization and bringing high-value jobs back on shore. So just wondered what your view is on that, and also the question of whether, if this happened, it would result in more low-value jobs gravitating back to developing economies.
Well, we're having that debate in the United States, okay? And there are a lot in our government who say, I want to subsidize these key industries like semiconductors to come back. Okay, now I'm going to say something about the US, which I think also applies to Australia, right? Which is you have to look at your capabilities and you have to invest in leading edge science and R&D. I like things that I've seen coming out of CSIRO. You have, I visited companies down there, Commonwealth Serum Labs, I visited them. You have a lot of capabilities, right? What you need to do is you need to invest in research and development of those kind of leading capabilities. I pointed out that, I hope you like my green screen here, right? This is on an Australian product that I'm using, okay? And these guys can't make them fast enough because during the pandemic, everybody's been buying them. I probably sold about 20 or 30 to my colleagues at the Harvard Business School, right? What you need to do is you need to come up with things that you do better than anybody else, independent of price, and it's possible. You see a lot of economies that are very small who have done that extraordinarily well. Look at Taiwan and semiconductors. Okay, look at Korea, right? Relatively, Taiwan's population is close to Australia, right? And geographically is smaller. Okay, but they've done that. They haven't done it overnight, right? It's, I remind people in the US, it's like TSMC and its leadership in semiconductors. They've been working at that since 1986, right? So 35 years, right? And there were many years when they didn't know if they were going to make it. Okay, but they stuck to it because they knew it was strategically important. And, my Taiwanese colleagues, it's like, we built this thing, it's like, it would really be a shame to lose it, right? And they invested when they didn't make a lot of money. Okay, and now they have a great position. All right. So it's possible, but you need to do things that play to your strengths that maybe others aren't as good at or don't have the energy to take on.
Yes, we could spend a lot of time on what the
I'm sure
of industry policy should look like. I'll just ask you one. I've just got one final question here, just a short one to finish off with. And the question is, have has rare metal extraction dodged international environmental laws, or will this remain poorly regulated?
Well, rare metal extraction, by the way, you have, is it Linus down in Australia who's building a factory in the US and you're mining that? That's a great opportunity, right? Because things like neodymium for magnets, for lithium and things like that. That's an opportunity to build higher value add too, right? So have they dodged environmental restrictions? Well, it turns out in China, the rare earth deposits are, a lot of it is in these clay-like soils in certain regions of China that make it very easy to extract. They're an environmental disaster when they do it because, they found ways to shortcut it by pumping brine into the soil and extracting it. Of course, then you ruin the land after that. China is beginning to realize that the environmental problems, they don't want the world's trash anymore, right? So they're beginning to realize is like they poisoned their soil, they poisoned their water, they poisoned their air, right? So that'll get better, but you still have other, you look at some of the stuff that goes on in India and Pakistan, it's like, this is terrible, right? But a lot of these guys say, well, you developed countries did it before us, so we want our chance to grow too. It's a hard problem, but I think those standards are going to get better and more uniform.
Okay, I think we'll have to end up there, and apologies to those who asked questions that we're not going to get to. We're obviously going to have to bring you back again, Willy, and in person next time, at least we hope so. And so on behalf of the Committee for Sydney and everyone tuning in today, I'd like to thank you very sincerely for really enlightening and perceptive account of what's going on with global supply chains and with globalization generally. This is still an unfolding story, and there's a lot more that will play out in the next few years. And so your insights today have been extremely valuable, and we greatly appreciate you spending time with us. We've got a hard stop at 10, so we're going to let you get on with your evening, Willy, and we'll get on with our day here, mostly. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the invitation, and my best to all of you. And you have a wonderful country and a wonderful city. So I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Willy.
Okay, bye-bye.